We don't have a middle class, and we have a captured top 3 or 2%. And they have nothing to show by themselves. Nothing stops us from investing 25% of the GDP, which will be 1.3 trillion a year.
You were quite outspoken about the National Development Plan, which you've called a flop.
By a plan, I say if wishes were horses, beggars could ride. That's what that document represents. When you seem to be speaking to people who have thumbs in their retinas and sticks in their and elbows in their ears, then we have a serious problem.
Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. And today, I'm very happy to be joined by a learned economist and statistician, someone whose views on South Africa's economy and society have been informing the nation for many decades, and former Statistician-General of South Africa, none other than Dr. Pali Lehohla. Dr. Lehohla, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's a great honor to have you.
It's a pleasure.
You were Statistician-General for 17 years and have been in the space of looking at statistics about South Africa for many decades. What was the biggest challenge and what was the biggest reward of being Statistician-General?
Well, there are many. I think many more challenges than rewards.
Yeah, I can imagine.
The first had nothing to do with statistics. But my role in statistics and probably a level of naivety that many have not come to know about, but an interesting naivety that played out. I mean, in 1989, I thought I was aware that I would have to move to Pretoria because I was in Bob. And a cousin of mine said, okay, no, go and buy a place at Royer's Kraal. Because I could see that my destiny was around here. So a colleague of mine with whom we were at university in Ghana ended up in Montana, and then we were talking. He said, oh, no, man, it could be a nice neighbor here. So I bought a second house. Not bought, because there's no cash, but you get a bond.
Sure.
So 5 years later, I have to move to Pretoria in 1995. So it's 1995. And then when I come, I have to occupy my house. Now these guys show me the bonds that, or rather the tenants, the leases, that they cannot leave the houses. So I say, well, does it mean I have to go and rent? I'm not going to rent when I'm leasing the houses out to other people.
Yeah.
So I thought I decided to buy it, get a third one. So now, later in 2002, when I became a Statistician-General, and then of course I got a few others in between, including my wife buying a guest house. Of course, on a bond too. So suddenly people say I've stolen money. And this becomes a big issue. So I'm sitting in my office in the morning and my PA says, there is a document on your desk. She brings the document and says this document was underneath the door. They dread it. So, as is usually the case, that the PA will read every document before they give to you. So I go through it. I find, oh my God, this is containing interesting information. It's 2002. So I called Trevor Manuel, the minister, there, and I say, hey, there is a document that is destined for you. But it landed on my desk. It was delivered to me by my PA. I've read it. It talks about me. I've copied it and I'm forwarding it to you. So he got very angry, agitated, but I said, well, it talks about me, so I photocopied it, kept a copy. So I forwarded it to him. the contents of the document were, oh, well, this man doesn't manage, he's corrupt, he's stolen money, he has so many houses, etc., etc. And he's bought, he's been greased, might have been greased on the basis of the technology that he was trying to adopt. I mean, statistical analysis software, any decent statistical institutions runs on that.
Absolutely.
And then you have updates of this thing.
Yeah.
And Professor Goodnight in Maryland, who established this, and the teams that he has across the world who make this available to society at a cost, of course, at a fee. I don't think he would stand anybody being bribed for. Besides, the people who advised on this were my deputies, and I said, oh, no, what you're advising is very good, let's go for it. So, SAS is an old software, but very sophisticated, competent in the market. The problem is it was less sophisticated in terms of delivery of physical products. It still printed on dot matrix when the printing now was more sophisticated.
Right.
Now, to come to that seamless computation, capture, computation, analysis, and report writing, it was being surpassed by more recent software in terms of interface, graphic interface for presentation, which is good. So they had just broken that and now have become more versatile. So we needed that interface from printing, from analysis to production to the market. So we needed that. I said, well, let's go and buy this. Let's get this license. Because there was always the risk of getting the data, recapturing it. And of course, you'll mess it up once you try to read data from the dot matrix and then try to capture it so that for a later date. So there was this. And I'm confronted with a census of 2001. And I'm aware of the difficulties that are embedded in 2001.
Yeah.
I've just had a serious problem with the consumer price index, which for 14 months I had just ballooned and exaggerated the CPI.
Yeah.
They're too not a fault of mine, but because I'm the last line of defense, I have to take the responsibility. In the main, the Treasury refused to give us 6 million to run a survey that would actually inform housing. And housing is a very difficult and stubborn component in the CPI. If you don't measure it well, it will run bubbles, it will run rings around you. So Treasury doesn't give us 6 million, pound foolish, penny wise, Treasury boys. So we don't get this money. And then we start adjusting continuously. So these are major issues. And then overlaying that is this one of somebody who has stolen money. I am 3 years or 2 years as the head of the institution. Of course, I've been in the organization for long. I mean, 15 years. At that point, I was 15 years. But 13 of those, it was in the 7 of those were in the homeland of Botswana, and then 2 were at head office. So here I carried the burden of responsibility, and in an environment where, at the time, I think things like corruption were still dealt with severely. If it was this time, it wouldn't matter anyway.
Yeah, you'd be fine now.
So this is the challenge that we face. And you are running an institution that still has to settle its racial contradictions. And we have to deal with the transformation real time. So it was a very interesting situation. But my laboratory in Botswana had been very nice. And had really brought me up in a way that, in fact, one of the reports I wrote after I ran the census of 1985 in Bob was how not to run it. So I had captured all the lessons. Being very transparent around what happens. It doesn't mean when you have said how not to run it the first time, you will get it right the second time. You'll find that it's many times when you say how not to run it. And so I had this knowledge behind me that, I can read all the signals. But this one of corruption was a nonsense factor. And I could either focus on the people that were organizing and undermining. But if I did, I would lose track of the work that has to be done.
Sure.
More so that it had a lot of pitfalls. And one had to deal with those pitfalls. And you couldn't have separate energies towards that. So that was a big one.
I can imagine. And I mean, you were subsequently cleared, you were vindicated, but I'm sure it must have been, particularly because you were so new in that role.
Yes.
Something quite difficult to deal with when there's a cloud over your name, but you know that you haven't. And it's funny to think of it now because you became almost a poster person for a clean institution at a time when we were struggling to find any clean institutions.
One of the things, I attribute this to myself, because this was very torturing for my children. So my eldest son would try and go and collect all the newspapers so that the younger brothers don't see them. So the one who ultimately became the journalist said, when are you going to collect the other ones in the street? So that morning I decided, this young man is giving me good advice. I went into the office, said to the PA, get all the clippings, cut them, enlarge them, put them on all lifts, on all floors, under my signature, so that staff do not, sweep with their eyes when I get into them.
Interesting. Very interesting.
I said, I don't know, you talk about this thing. So on all floors was all this.
Wow.
Each time there was something in the maid, put it there under my signature. That there is your corrupt statistician.
What was the most rewarding moment of your tenure?
Well, the most rewarding moment, I think all those came in interesting bouts. The first was really taking over the side of the national account from the Treasury, which was the expenditure side. Not National Treasury, but the Reserve Bank.
I see.
Because there's always a moral hazard for a player to be a referee and a player. I mean, the Reserve Bank makes decisions. But that I got towards the end of my tenure, which was 2017. But it was very important to get the national account.
Explain exactly what is even some of us who have
GDP.
Even some of us who have PhDs, you're going over our heads now.
The GDP is measured in a number of ways, income and expenditure. So the production side and the expenditure side. The STSA was dealing with the production side, and then the expenditure side was done at the Treasury.
Oh, I see.
At the Reserve Bank.
At Reserve Bank,
And that was a moral hazard. That all that has to be under one roof.
Sure.
But historically, it had been that way. So we had to really get ourselves to train people to do the expenditure side, identify them from university, train them on this, and almost like Marines, train them like Marines. And then we had a Canadian who was number 2 to Felegi in Canada. He was in his 70s, and he took time to actually, we built this kind of people. They were led by one of the young stars at STSA, Mike Manamela, who ultimately got stolen by the Reserve Bank.
There you go.
And left the office and the organization at the time. But Rashad Kasim, who was the head of economic statistics, had moved to the Reserve Bank, and when he left, I said, well, we'll have to succeed on this project. So he became an agent of change in the Reserve Bank for us to take over this.
Wow.
So it was in it rest leadership lessons of how you transform an institution, have a takeover of a unit from the Reserve Bank that was preferred without taking the people, but exploiting the expertise that we created. And it was a very rewarding moment, so that now, finally, the GDP is accounted for, the national accounts are under one roof. And we actually deepened the expertise in the organization.
Yeah.
I suppose it's that ethos of deepening expertise, creating institutions of competence, such as, of course, the one that we created at Stellenbosch, Center for Regional and Urban Innovation and Statistical Exploration, which came as a consequence of, realizing that these numbers are not just numbers, they are manifesting over space. Now, common sense tells you that happens, but there is a much deeper science and knowledge base that you have to invest in to do that. So that's why we created that Center for Regional and Urban Innovation and Statistical Exploration at Stellenbosch. A long story about that. I wanted to create this whilst I was in BOP at the University of Potchefstroom in 1992. It took us a full 18 years to get it running.
Wow.
At Stellenbosch. And the Manicheya went there and started this. And we have about 90, 100 MPhil people. But that's what anchors this organization. That's why you see it didn't get shaken.
It's such
in this period. And then another that has been very fantastic has been about multidimensional poverty. And that part, it's as an outcome, as an impact measure, the government is ignoring it. And more recently, we have been discussing with Parliament that, hey, look, you better use this as an outside-in measure for you as parliamentarians to manage the executive.
Absolutely.
Because without that serious impact measure, you're not going to change this poverty inequality, and we'll go over it again and again, like reading the Rosary.
And we have been doing for
so
30 years.
Yes, yeah.
Is there a particular statistical trend or data point that kept you up at night, or that keeps you up at night from that period? These other parts that I'm talking about were in my latter period, from 2011 going. Before there were quite a number. I mean, the CPI was a surprise number, of course. Yeah, well.
There's an episode to it.
Yes.
So Tito Mboweni, we want to go and see him, because when I came in to lead the organization, I followed on Mark Ocken. Mark, we actually fought back to back with him. I was looking at the census, the population side of the organization. He was looking at the overall as the studies head of the office. But the chunk that was on the population census, including the census itself, were under me. And there we created a new organization. Of course, we are creating a new organization called Stats SA. But the real change that actually brought more black people into the organization that came from the population census demography side, and brought a new ethos into the organization, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So the Mark left in 2000. And then I started being a Statistician-General then in November of that year. The work had not been completed. Of course, 5 years is too short, but he had started the right path. Economic statistics were yet to be transformed, and it was a tough path. And these things affect the markets. Now we have messed up the CPI in 2002. And at the time, I'd gone to see Tito Mboweni, and I saw Trevor Manuel as well. I said, hey, there are a lot of problems in the economic statistics. We have to deal with the changes there too. And when you deal with changes, the markets don't want change. They want stability. Now, when you mess up the CPI and then you change other indices, they ask whether that is change, real change, or is messing up. That period was a period of turmoil.
Yeah.
Very, very tumultuous. Very, very much so. And I would argue that all economic statistics indicators kept me awake all the time.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Any that scare you now when you look at where we are as a country and as someone who has lived your life and poured your expertise into creating the data that we all use? Is there any of the statistics that you feel this actually scares me?
Not quite. I think the organization has enough, has depth. We've built enough depth in there. But I think the fact that the organization is not financed properly, we have started eating seed. So once you start eating seed, you're not going to... I mean, this program that I started at Stellenbosch, where we trained so many people, a good number of those were hotcakes for the rest of the world. These international organizations. They just left, they got picked. I mean, when I went to the UN Statistics Commission, there were about 5 of these people in that space from the same country, from the one organization called Stats SA, in different organizations, representing different organizations. So you see that level of success in terms of just the possibility of building human beings, human capacity at the level that has not been easily witnessed.
Absolutely. And I don't mean from the perspective of the quality of the data, but the substance. Is there an unemployment figure or a poverty?
Oh, you mean the data itself?
Yes.
What the data says? No, you know, the problem is you can enjoy the capacity, the ability to place the truth on the table and engage and be prepared to engage on it. But when you seem to be speaking to people who have thumbs in their retinas and sticks in their and elbows in their ears, then you have a serious problem. You got an unemployment that has set there. You got poverty statistics that are reversing. For instance, a very clear monotonic decline of poverty, multidimensional poverty, in fact, from 2001 to 2011, monotonically, and then a reversal of a third of those municipalities, 82 of them reversed the gains between 2011 and 2016. The Statistician-General has just released income and expenditure statistics that show a very worrying trend. And then you'll be releasing income, multidimensional poverty data analysis of that in another 3 months. I'm sure all municipalities have reversed.
Can I dive into each of those? Because there's stories there. I mean, unemployment is something that it's almost just become a word that we use. I mean, what has happened with unemployment in our country, since the advent of democracy at a high level, so that we can understand the actual scale of this problem and take it from a word to an actual event in the day-to-day lives of people?
Well, I mean, if you think about the time, end of about 2007, unemployment had dropped to 22%. That is 22 in every 100 were not working who were able-bodied and looking for a job. That number has reversed to 32% now, and it's but that's the official rate. But they expanded unemployment, which means you stop looking for jobs because your shoe has a hole, and there's no need to go and search when you know there's nothing. That goes up to 47%. Amongst the youth, it gets worse even. So unemployment has been a scourge for the country. And a number of correlates and determinants of this. One of those which really is clearly a driver, is that when we changed the mandate of the SOEs, almost privatized them or retained them, central to the creation of the SETAs, sector employment things, we removed this from the ESCOMs, the Transnets or SpureNet and so on.
Interesting.
So
okay. Yeah.
then we eroded the possibility of technical education that these institutions interfaced with the technicons or TVETs, and they name them.
So that used to be in-house, and then we kind of dislodged it from those institutions.
They had an organic system
Sure.
that fed one from the other, and then indeed mitigated the problems with the private sector, because the people, once you've worked at ESCOM, they didn't need even to interview you, I'm sure.
Yeah,
they just
sure.
said, we know this one is competent. Now, once we did that, you'll see that Megawatt, Megapark, Megapark, and the other center where they trained, the grass is this big. So by removing, that's creating these things that became universities, training colleges, and so on. That, I think, was a very stupid move. While we needed to at least strive for equality, but that's not how you acquire equality. You do not reduce things to the lowest common denominator.
Yeah, yeah.
You aspire for the highest and find pathways towards that and deal with racism and confront it. I mean, you don't have to mince your words when you deal with racism. You deal with it, confront it, and a government, and you have all the instruments to do so. You don't go to the lowest common denominator in order to accommodate things. But that's one part. The second part is we have never dealt with the spatial apartheid, which undermined the possibilities of building the necessary skills, because people are far away from everything about everything. And we never addressed the destructive nature of apartheid itself. Part of the problem is that we've gone into a degenerative cycle that produces negative outcomes. And then we actually use our policy instruments to try and deal and mitigate negative outcomes and find ourselves in them. We no longer know what success actually means. For instance, when we have 28 million people receiving grants, we use that as an argument for success, even in political campaigns. Now, when you do that, even when you probably don't mean that success, in a politically heated system, you say that is success.
Yeah.
And we now no longer know what achievement is. So if you think about something called demographic dividend, the president will say demographic dividend as though we eat dividend. And everybody, there's potential. I say, but we don't need potential. The point is, this demographic, what appears to be a demographic bulge, it's a consequence of a failed process. It's a consequence of apartheid design. It was never meant to benefit black people. And until you intervene very aggressively into that bulge, you can't intervene into it with social grants. You've got to intervene with it with empowering tools for society. And it's an interesting, and people have not paid enough attention to this. So with apartheid, you get migration. And this migration creates interesting problems at family formation. So you got all these migrants, you got all the women remaining behind. Life goes on there. With those women remaining behind.
Yeah, sure.
And the migrant spends more than 12 months on the mine, at least 12 months.
Sure.
And life goes on, but there is no child born in that period. Now, the ability of contraception in South Africa, use of contraception amongst blacks and coloreds was a consequence of migratory labor system. It wasn't a consequence of being people enlightened and being educated and therefore using contraception as a system that answers their elevated education, like amongst Afrikaners and Indians. It was when they got educated, they realized that they have to deal with their fertility so that they can do things beyond childbearing. Amongst blacks and coloreds, contraception adoption was to deal with the moral hazard of infidelity. So you get this product of a demographic transition that is anchored in the wrong science.
And what is that? What is the demographic transition that happened that we are now currently dealing with?
So now, you drop from having 6 children to about 2 children.
Sure.
South Africa is about 2.3 children.
Right.
Amongst blacks, it's lower than 3. It's about 2.4. Amongst whites, it's about 1.8. They are below replacement.
I see.
So if you want to fight a land reclamation, you can wait a few hundred years. All these guys will not be there, so you can take the land anyway. That's not a problem. So now,
just statistically, sure.
But of course, you don't want to have hundreds years of suffering. You need to get this land.
Sure.
So blacks have entered that period of transition where fewer children are born. And fewer die.
Right.
But there's that bulge that is moving. And when you look at that bulge that is moving amongst whites, you currently see a Korea in South Africa, whereas up to 70% of whites have a degree, and they are all employed. 7% unemployment is a very low unemployment. Amongst Indians, slightly higher, but we see that rapid transition. Amongst blacks, this bulge doesn't have education. Only 10% of them have a degree. And you cannot have 10% of the population at higher levels of education managing a complex economy and think that will succeed.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, you go into a nation building question. Students rose and said, fees must fall. White, black, Indian, and everything. A penny-wise, pound-foolish government decides that pay for the rich, pay for the poor, and allow the rich to pay for themselves. Where is the nation building question? If you are nation building, you'll say, I pay for all youth of South Africa.
Agreed.
Besides, there is not any other space in the country where we congregate in those critical masses. And by definition, you have an elite, perhaps, that you have to make sure that they don't become elitist. But by teaching them together, they can be a patriotic elite. Now, we don't have a patriotic elite.
Yeah.
So we don't have stadia of building a nation. So ours is sloganeering. Building a nation, dealing with poverty, and it's reading the rosary.
Absolutely.
So these are the kinds of things that we have not paid attention to.
You've been quite outspoken. It feels like as time went on, you became even more and more outspoken. But recently you were quite outspoken about the National Development Plan, which you've called a flop. Take us through why you think that the aspirations we've put down on paper are just not enough to take us to where we need to go as a nation.
Yes, I mean, if by a plan, I say if wishes were horses, beggars could ride. That's what that document represents. It's a good document because Parliament said we like it. All sides of Parliament said we like this. But there was no path to achieving that. There was no moment to think, what does it take to do the things that we aspire for?
Yeah.
And we are trapped in that. And we are trapped in actually quoting it all the time. Speech after speech. I mean, it's meaningless. Completely meaningless.
Yeah.
We haven't, you see, if we cannot have future proof of anything, then you have a serious problem. Future proof is not foolproof. But future proof makes you to attend to the things that have to be done to achieve that which you have specified as or something that we want to do. Take, for instance, the president's speech says we'll put 900 billion in infrastructure over the next, I think it says 5 years or 3 years, it doesn't matter.
Right.
Let me say it's 5 years or 3 years. It really matters not, because 900 billion for effective infrastructure,
it's just not enough.
Which then deals with gross fixed capital formation, is just not enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, when you leave that to fortune, the amount is so small that you'd rather use it for something else rather than an illusion, being delusional about fixed capital formation that can actually impact on growth and impact on dealing with the backlogs.
And it sounds like a big number, so everyone thinks...
Well, that's what mesmerizes our parliamentarians that cannot relate to this number in as far as fixed capital formation is concerned. So when you don't have, you are not savvy technically around what the meaning of these things are, you have a serious problem.
How much investment in infrastructure do you think we need over a 3-year period to really get this economy into gear?
Well, now you talk about gear. Well, there's an experiment that we had, which was very interesting. It probably was not labeled anything. It was just a set of policies that were put together.
Yeah.
But the experiment is worth going back to. And I had some arguments with colleagues more recently, and I continue to have those. If you look at 2002, up to 2007.
That
by
period
2007, there were things that in an economy that is developmental, you are more likely to get those outcomes. One, poverty was reduced.
Yeah, sure.
Both multidimensionally and otherwise. Not to the level that you need to reduce it, but you could see a place like Msinga, and I want to talk about Msinga shortly, which was the poorest as of 2001, moving fast to reducing all its poverty by up to 60%.
Wow. Yeah, sure. So something was happening in that era.
Something was happening, but Msinga is an important one. I'll come back to that. Gross fixed capital formation. Sure. Which is what the question we're asking: how much do you need to invest?
Yeah, basically around infrastructure and building things.
It was 25% of the GDP annually.
Right. So about a quarter of annual GDP.
In fact, at 30%, you are flying. 25% is fine. So 25% of the GDP was piled back into the economy every year in infrastructure. Credit extension was 15% annually. Annual growth.
Right.
Not but annual growth of 15% in terms of credit extension. Interest rates were low.
Sure.
Minus the one that I messed up with the CPI. Enrollment in schools just surged in that period, of course, adding to Madiba's saying where every child must be in school. And I think the feeding scheme was going very well. So you can see all these outcomes.
Sure.
Suggesting that something coherent with development outcomes is happening in the economy.
Yeah, sure.
Now, many all argue that China was thirsty for the minerals and that we are building stadia and so on. World Cup, yes. It's true that was the case. And the outcomes were likable. Of course, there was a debt to GDP ratio that dropped to 25%. Whether we should have kept debt to GDP ratio 25%, I mean, it's quite debatable because you have to spend rather than keep to debt to GDP ratio.
Sure.
So the conditions today still exist. We need gross fixed capital formation at 25% because the shacks and everything require that kind of investment.
Absolutely. Service delivery
Nothing
requires
stops us from doing that. Nothing stops us from investing 25% of the GDP, which will be 1.5, 1.3 trillion a year, not 300 billion.
Wow. So we're currently at 900 billion over 3 or 5
years.
And we actually need 1.5 trillion per
every
year.
year. Now you see where the arithmetic doesn't work. Minerals, whether it's coal or what have you, are still demanded, including rare minerals, by China.
China's not.
Yes.
Yeah.
So those conditions that are attributed to that span of 5 years are still here.
Absolutely.
So the only thing that is remaining is political will and decision making.
And so when we look at this budget, which you've also been quite critical of, and there's been a big debate about where we get the revenue and the VAT. Maybe what we have missed is that we need to get more serious about our expenditure. What would you, Treasury's response is that, well, yeah, but then we might have to take on more debt and that's damaging to the economy. How do you respond to that perspective?
I mean, you just look at Traore. He said, I don't know, we have uranium here. We are taking charge of our uranium. And that's where you go to Norway, they say our oil. This is our oil. It's not an oil that belongs to a private sector.
Yeah.
This is our coal. Now, when you do that, then you take charge of your development. Of course, we didn't do that in 2002 to 2007, but we could have done that.
Sure.
So these are the things that even the UK, when you look at their development plan now, they are actually going back to development planning. Getting the infrastructure right, their language is not a Thatcherite language or Reagan language. It's a different language. It's almost close to what China does and talks about. So now going back to Msinga, because I think the Msinga thing is very important. I was talking to the late Dr. Matlati. What was no, the name goes. Dr. Matlati tells the story that herself and Bosi Slope, Mrs. Dr. Bam, had camped in Msinga in the 90s. That was a hotbed of crime, or not crime, but political violence.
Right.
They had to work through Msinga. And one has to say, what is it, therefore, that made Msinga, when the conditions allowed, to accelerate, to reduce poverty?
Yeah.
Because by so working in there, as creating multi-party coalitions that could understand that we need to deal with conflict. We need to deal with all these social ills. When in 2000, And when we measure in 2001 and measure in 2016, you see Msinga accelerating its development. Those are the nuggets that we need to understand in order to deal with our problems. And Msinga is such an important nugget. And probably there are many more in there that we can learn from.
Yeah.
And having learned from there, then we say, how do we replicate these lessons so that we can get better outcomes? But we don't learn from the examples that are embedded in the data. So the challenges amongst the things that we confront, political violence seems to be returning. It's not political violence, but practices that do not bring society together are problems that are hampering us from moving forward, including now the Afrikaners opening their own university.
Sure.
Now, where is the nation building project? When nation building and cohesion, both at the South African level, at the African continental level, is the necessary ingredient for us to move forward. It's not there. These are the kinds of problems. So your question of how much do we need to invest in order to make change, it's actually investing in both the physical things, expropriating some of them, certainly we should do that, because the kind of dilemma that we face in this country is that we're collapsing. I mean, our scenarios say so.
Yeah.
The first scenario that Madiba went for was the Montreux scenarios, which changed our path from RDP.
Right.
One has to argue again there to say, look, at the time, Russia was nowhere to be seen, which was the strongest ally of the ANC. Cuba was the only one breathing and standing. But relative to big economics and all that, it was relatively small, but it showed its resilience. It still continues to show its resilience today. Perhaps we should have taken their example. But without Russia and without China, because by 1989 China was nowhere. I mean,
absolutely. One of the poorest economies per capita.
Absolutely. And the Deng was very angry at China being where it is. I mean, if you look at the book by, what is this lady writes about how China didn't bite the forbidden fruit. And Gorbachev was on his glasnost and perestroika, which was the cookbook of Milton Friedman.
Sure.
And as a consequence of that, Russia lost life expectancy, lost jobs. I mean, Russia was almost destroyed completely until Putin came into power.
Two very important cases, because China, on the one hand, didn't do the neoliberal consensus.
Yes.
Russia did.
And then it collapsed.
Sure.
Of course, China still had its own problems. But then when Milton Friedman came to China, he was almost there. But Russia taught him a lesson. He said, I don't want to be like Russia. And he said, no, we have our markets. The markets, Chinese understanding of the ever-normal granary. And that's what China did, and they're shooting at the light with that which is heavy, which is the commanding height. So at that point, and that was the condition, that the ANC will negotiate and will get the ear of the world, provided Russia has collapsed in terms of socialism. And the ANC couldn't lead socialism outside Russia anyway. There were no allies. The only allies were Mozambique and Angola. And then we look at that to find that they started to... So Mandela comes from prison. He finds himself in this. So basically one can understand how the shift from RDP to GEAR took place in the Montreux scenarios, which were asking, will the transition occur? Will it occur fast enough? Will the policies not be populist. We ticked all those three. The promise of the Montclair scenario were that democracy will be inclusive and growth will be inclusive. Growth was not inclusive. And the shift in 2002 was to deal with this growth that was not inclusive. But unfortunately, or rather, there are no unfortunates here. Things are done. There was no line of sight or future sight beyond the World Cup. And everybody was focusing on when the World, instead of saying South Africa has 20 World Cups and we need a World Cup every year. So we should continue on the infrastructure beyond 2007. And as far as the minerals are concerned, you got to think about sovereign wealth. You've got to think about all these other things in order to have a counter cycle when the cycles of minerals. So
absolutely.
That absence of an economic policy that is well informed. My apologies for taking this long, but I thought where we are today it's neither fish nor foul. It's a very difficult situation.
And we're glad that you elaborated. This channel is where people educate themselves and understand things in more depth. And you've helped us to do that. When you were talking about mineral wealth and getting serious about owning our mineral wealth, I was looking at the Trump administration and this Keir Starmer administration in the UK. And they've both established sovereign wealth funds. And this is the US and the UK. China, obviously, as you say, has done it a long time ago. Norway, there's some African examples. But it's so fascinating to me that a country with so much mineral wealth hasn't found a mechanism to use that wealth to benefit the people.
You see, the problem is this, that we don't have a middle class. That's one. And we have a captured top 3 or 2%. And they have nothing to show by themselves. They created nothing. And when you have created nothing and you are around the table, you can't create something. And we need to introspect very, very, very seriously. That the only condition that we can do something is to create our own table. And the ingredients for that table are there. You have the majority population. You have things that you can change in the laws on ownership. For the benefit, you cannot deal with this crisis of education, of only 10% of the population having the technical know-how to lead, where the world succeeds when it has 50% or more of their population having that ability. It cannot be business as usual. The minerals have to be able to do that. It's not tax. Tax is too little. Anyway, even when it is there, we steal it. So the absence of discipline. So it is using these assets as sovereign wealth to create the necessary human resources that are required. At this rate, we are not going anywhere. Dangote, patriotic capital, invests in Nigeria. Absolutely. Gross fixed capital formation, the biggest refinery in the world. Traore says, the uranium, I'm taking it. And with Niger and Mali, they do that. South Africa has so much that these things must be in the interest of the nation. So is Trump, so is Starmer. Norway has led the way all along. Milton Friedman's economics have gone past sell-by date long ago. And the climate and the environment have become very important allies. I mean, Russia didn't respect climate and the environment. So did China. They didn't. So they were in the same club or same league as the capitalists, in as far as that is concerned.
Sure.
But climate and the environment are fighting their battle. And as they do that, they are joining labor to fight for better conditions. But in South Africa, if that labor is not educated or trainable, information technology will leave them out. But to catch up, you need to use the resources that are there.
So you, when I put all of this together, are advocating for a prolonged period of sustained investment and expenditure into infrastructure, into education, into the country. That may involve, in the short term, taking on more debt if we have to. In the long term, creating a structure through which our mineral wealth can benefit the population, like other countries have, and almost an age of investment so that we can catch up to where we need to go to?
Well, there is a serious investment gap in South Africa. The only thing is that blacks think that something is theirs. And when we go out and other visitors come here, congratulate us as South Africans that we are sophisticated. And of course, when they pour you accolades, you get pampered and you dance to that illusion. High time we actually realize that no, for those things to be ours, a different struggle has to be. I don't think we need more debt.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
We already have, the stock exchange is 18 trillion, I think, or 20 trillion. Of money. Some of the money doesn't belong to us, but at least it's an attractive stock exchange.
Sure.
Pensions, 2-point-something trillion, and then another trillion there, and so on and so on. When you aggregate all these things, and then think development, saying, what do I have? Those are the things we have. And if the stock exchange, Johannesburg Stock Exchange, is one of the 30 in the world, the highest. You got to say, I want to look like Luxembourg, or I want to look like that one or that one. What do I need to do to look like that one, given that I'm in that club? Then when you look at those things, you'll find that they don't do the things that we do in South Africa. They don't have the kind of population we have. They have educated people. So what do you need to educate people? So there are examples that are there to say, if I have this quality and that quality, how do I make sure that everybody rises to that and not use the lowest common denominator? So all those things are about economic policies, and economic policies whose outcomes is what I started by saying, multidimensional poverty, how do you reduce it? How does Parliament marshal the executive towards reducing these things that we don't like? And therefore, what are the laws that have to be changed, given that these are the assets that South Africa has? I mean, this country has a lot of going for it. A lot of, as we were walking, I told you that here's the rail. They've stolen the steel, the rail line. But where the rail used to run is still there. That's intellectual property, the plan itself. And you need that intellectual property to go. The physical things, yes, it's fine. You can always produce them and lay them there. So there's a lot that is known about South Africa, which is basically an asset. And what we have to do is just to get that asset to. Now, one of my problems is that Africans don't use statistics. And unfortunately, they collect them but don't use them. One of the things that we collect is called International Comparisons Program. is this one that I was talking about that China said they are not the biggest economy.
Right.
For Africans, we use that data to know how much we will get as an allowance when we go to New York or to Geneva or to those kinds of centers and so on. We are not using that information to inform our industrialization strategy. Here is what China did. China refused to accept that they are the biggest economy. I asked Mr. Wewe, Professor Wewe, why did you refuse that we are the biggest economy in 2014 when we released the results? He didn't answer me. But two things emerged in the meeting that we had convened in Paris about the ICP, where China was saying they are not the biggest economy. They refused flatly. But the key was not about, when I talked to Minister Manuel, I said, no, we need to convene a meeting in Paris. And I talked to the guys that first, Angus Deaton's suggests decision to us as the board, recommendation to us as the board for China to be expelled is the right decision, but it's not implementable. So I said, it's not implementable, so it's a non-decision therefore. So what do we need to do? What we need to do is to sit with China and understand what their problem is. And I was convinced that the problem of China was not the numbers, that they are the biggest, because the methods are very clear. And it can be, and when we went there and did the runs, they left China as the biggest economy. But the Chinese still said they are not accepting the result. But what was important was to understand that there are always at times technical problems. And technical problems are easy. But there are adaptive problems that require adaptive change. And you need to understand what is it in the adaptive change that is necessary to deal with. Two things were there that became clear when we met with the Chinese, when they were saying they don't accept the results. But in the heat of the discussion and the moment, they would say, what? China, the biggest economy of the world? No. And then we take the responsibility for the world. No. They were not ready. And then they say, at least if it was 3 years later.
Yeah.
Because they had actually measured that 3 years later they will be the biggest economy.
Wow.
But the baby arrived too early. So they had three problems. One, the baby arrived too early. Two, they wouldn't manage the decisions around trade when once they are the biggest economy, things begin shifting.
Sure.
For them to take more responsibility. And three was the internal issue around China, that they have not prepared the Chinese society to understand that they are the biggest economy. And therefore the Chinese may erupt and say they want money, salaries for the biggest economies. Those were the three things that emerged in the meeting. And when that emerged, I talked to the chairperson and my colleagues. I said, I think we know what is the pain in China. It's not about these numbers. It's about those adaptive change issues. And the resolution then that came at the UN Statistics Commission around ICP, which is the International Comparison Program, was China doesn't accept the results, but you can use them.
There you go. Yeah.
They look at the Chinese. They
we don't accept this. Yeah.
But they look at the they say you can use them. Now, what did China do? I was invited to China in 2013, January. I just released the results of Census 2011 here. And the question that China was asking at the time, even before the ICP results came in 2014, was what are the economic implications on China's population in the light of the 2010 census?
Right.
Now, I just released the census results and then, of course, presented them in Mangaung subsequent to the release. And we're all yellow there, gold. Comrade Statistician-General. No discussion about the results. China engaged the numbers. After 5 days of engagement, 3 resolutions came out of that. And the professor, and there were the China Statistics Bureau. There were intellectuals, there were politicians, every formation was there. And the lead person who was going to take this there was this man who was going to take this to Politburo. I mean, this guy was disabled. He was sitting on a wheelchair. He didn't talk throughout. And, when he read the resolutions and concluded the meeting, that these 3 resolutions are going to be presented at the Politburo. 1.
Yeah.
The implications of the economy of China on the population is that we will not have workforce. We will not have people who will consume. Now we are going to increase the number of children that Chinese women can give birth to. 2 children now from one child.
So that's when the one China policy moved.
They said 2 children. And that means the population of China the structure is going to change. Not the absolute numbers, the 1.4 million, no. It will change the structure. And as it changes the structure, and given their 100-year planning, they know that if the structure changes, they'll have the labor, they'll have the consumption. So when Trump comes with his antiques in 2017 they wouldn't be affected because they're having a growing consuming population.
Sure. The base.
So now they will grow through domestic consumption as a consequence. Now the ICP then becomes important for China, and they invited Michel Mwela-Kutula, an African from Congo Brazza. A story behind him too, a long story about him. He's the late, but they invited him. They had refused his results. But they invite him to come and discuss about ICP for adoption in China, so that they can know what the Chinese consume, what the world consumes, but how they can create an infrastructure of an ICP-based system, international China international comparison, China comparisons program to inform industrialization in China for a population of 2 children per family, which will be a growing population. Third, they would still sustain export-led.
Right.
Those are the 3 resolutions that were taken.
Very interesting, because it makes me realize that the census is such an important economic tool, not just to know where you are, but to plan where you want to go. And it's almost as if economic strategy starts from there.
Absolutely. It starts from that.
Yeah.
Because your administrative records, which are good, I mean, like in Norway and these other places, Sweden and so on, where they don't run this rudimentary census. They get the administrative records, they have addresses of everybody. By bringing those databases, they've got a clearer picture.
Yeah.
Now here, we fight over the address system. Who has to run it between Post Office, Home Affairs, not Home Affairs, Home Affairs was there, also Statistics South Africa and so on. After Mokoen said, there cannot be an election that is fair until people have an address. We've been in this for the longest period as of Statistics South Africa. The 1996 census, we were spraying numbers on houses. And people started using those as addresses. I felt that was the biggest failure I had. To allocate a number that people appropriate so dearly as identity. Which was just for purposes of just saying how many people are in here.
Yeah.
So changes of a substantive nature such as addresses actually empower people. So the census itself provides these attributes that help for economic planning. So that's what China did about this when it refused to accept the international comparisons program.
It's an amazing
insight.
And
used it to inform their economic strategy going forward.
We just take a census and then, okay, that's the
Corporate Statistician-General, well presented, comrade. Very nice, very nice. Informative. I have to ask, informative in what way?
Yeah.
Now. When you think about this and the creation of this center I'm talking about at Stellenbosch, it had to do with how we present statistics. And one of the things that came out of the team that went there to Stellenbosch was to understand an important concept, which is called geographically weighted regression analysis. In statistics, you just draw, or economics, you draw regression lines. And Professor Crick, he was awarded a medal, probably by Foster or Botta. He came with the term kriging. He was a geologist, a South African geologist, and came with the term kriging. When he observed that the distribution of minerals do not follow the pattern that others follow. They are not linear. They are all kinds of things. So kriging then got adopted in social sciences and economics. And out of it, you can actually understand cultural economic geography. That there's no linearity in this, because culture, economic geography, and geography determines and is part and parcel of the economic thought. And when you remove geography and culture from economics, you are remaining with nothing really.
Sure.
And that's what we have in South Africa. We don't have geography, we don't have culture. And we say we are planning economics. You can't. Now, one of the things that you when you try to draw these regression lines or analysis of sorts, you may actually have a northeast kind of line. When you break down this into geographically weighted regression, you may actually be having southeast pointing regression lines. Now, your prediction model, when it's actually this, and most of the time, you find that, of course, in South Africa, you don't deal with any prediction models. So it's a hodgepodge of things that are uninformed. But if we were to be serious, we actually have to, particularly when we think about the district development model, which, of course, is not based on our thinking. It's one of those things where you say district development model, but you don't have the science below it, the theory below it, and all those kinds of things.
That's so interesting, because I remember looking at a set of statistics about unemployment, and then when it was disaggregated regionally, one realized that if we could resolve the unemployment problem in the Eastern Cape, then a lot of the national picture would itself resolve. So that when we pinpoint these things geographically, suddenly we realize if we can solve that, I guess it's like what you were saying about Masinga. If we can resolve and understand certain problems in certain places, that can then help the national picture to resolve itself.
And the solutions are not the same, although the methods in terms of conception of this, if they're anchored in empathy, in leadership, in that, as constructs that will deploy to that system, that will be the same approach. But in terms of the conditions that are there, I mean, this reminds me when you mentioned Eastern Cape. We are flying with the then Secretary-General of the ENC, and then we meet in the plane, and the business reported actually, Business Day, had lashed out on this economic statistics, employment, and say, well, they say those guys who are looking after sheep are employed, or harvesting is employed. They say, what kind of employment is that? Very derogative. And then, of course, this makes me think a little bit and look back into the data. And I see huge swings in employment in agriculture for the same time periods. I mean, those if you have this level of employment in December, August, and in June, and though that disappears in the next year, something is terribly wrong. You expect seasonality in the data, and that seasonality disappears. So when that seasonality disappears with high unemployment, then we'll actually worry much. So I asked Secretary-General of the ENC, there's something that we are seeing in the Eastern Cape that doesn't make sense. So he says, SG, no, the harvest was so huge last year, and the rains and everything. So the maize harvest, there is so much, it goes to the roof. Now, how are you going to plow the next year? I mean, you'll be expelled from your rendezvous by the maize because it reaches Now, which begs the second question is, what are the value chains of processing this maize to the mill, to the supply chains of shops and so on, so that there's a constant supply? In the Eastern Cape, the fields are fallow. And they are fallow not because the farmers were not growing, but because of the broken value chains. And these value chains need systems, systems thinking, systems design.
And the infrastructure investment needs to facilitate that value chain. It's not just investment in the air, it's actually economic investment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So if you don't have modeling at the center of your thinking, and you come with 900 billion and say it will make the economy grow, then you can see the limitations in our technical competency. And that's part of the problem, and a substantial part of the problem.
Well, Dr. Lehohla, that's all we have time for today. Thank you. Thank you for really helping us to see our economy in a different way and see the data in a different way in this episode, but also through the work you've undertaken in both creating a credible institution that tells us the truth, even when politicians might not like it, which I'm sure was a very difficult thing to do, but also in explaining the data to the nation. And we thank you for your contribution to our country over many decades.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. I think
this historic juncture of our country and, of course, of the world. And,
absolutely.
A great country that has so much potential.
Indeed. I think we might have to have part 2 and part 3 because there's so much we could still unpack.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe. Make sure you help us get to 250,000 subscribers. Tell us what you learned in this episode. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And make sure you comment down below. Keep it locked on SMWX. Aye.